Mother fricker.
This thing is slippery, dude. The Tao
What
is
the
so
crud?
abstract.
Dude, that's bull
You
crud.
can't even get it to stay on a table. This is some slippery philosophy. That's why I don't mess with this Eastern crap. Just slips right through your hands.
Yeah, the books are more liquidy.
They're always paperback. They're thin. They're clean. It's just night school.
Night school.
Second book of the Tao by Stephen Mitchell. So I want to start by telling you all the things that are dope about Stephen Mitchell.
Okay.
He was a Yale-educated linguist, and then he just dropped off and meditated for 20 hours a day for 10 years as a Zen Buddhist. And then...
Like living at a monastery then?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and then after that period, he dropped off Zen meditation as his practice and adopted instead as his practice translating scripture. Because in the same sense that he would absorb his whole attention in meditation and adopt a clear mind and experience reality, he started making it his practice to be able to hear scripture with a completely clear mind so that he can detect on an awareness level the spirit of the scripture that he's reading and translating. So he's an accomplished scholar, and he's somebody who's taken the time to be able to drop his personal lenses and just read the scripture with a profound directness.
That's a really interesting idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, like meditatively reading a book. That's cool.
Yeah. He says, like, I listened to an interview he did with Tony Robbins and Tony Robbins' wife, Sage, and he was saying that he doesn't meditate anymore, that translating scripture is his practice. That's what he gives his undivided attention to. That's his service. That's what he focuses on. And he did my favorite translation of the Bhagavad Gita and the Tao Te Ching. It's incredible that one person could do such good translations of both of those books, because they're both about God, they're both about ultimate reality, but not in the same sense, like not in the same way. The Bhagavad Gita is a dialogue between, it was Arjuna and Krishna, and Krishna is a Christ figure in yoga, and Arjuna was a disciple figure learning from Krishna throughout the book. So it was a dialogue back and forth. And there's tons of references to Hindu mythology and using Hindu mythology as symbols to explain concepts. And so you need some yoga philosophy and Hindu mythology to really understand why they're using the examples that they are. And then the Tao Te Ching is just a sage named Lao Tzu explaining in plain English, as much as that's possible, what ultimate reality is. And both of those scriptures, and then Stephen Mitchell also did a really good book on the Joseph story. He did a translation of Genesis. I believe he did a translation of Job.
I'm sorry, the Joseph story?
Yeah, like Joseph in the Old Testament, who was...
Oh, he had a coat, right?
Yeah, coat of many colors.
Right. Okay.
So, like, no matter where you put him, he's going to find a way to thrive in that environment because he's just ordained to... I mean, there's a lot of different ways to think about that.
Okay.
But he was the guy who was sold into slavery by his brothers and then jailed because it was like the Pharaoh's wife tried to come onto him and was mad that she couldn't have him, so she made an accusation. He went to jail. Then he got out of jail for interpreting a dream that the Pharaoh had, and then he was like one of the rulers. He was like the Pharaoh's right-hand man or something like that.
Cool dude.
So he did a story about that in The Art of Forgiveness and how Joseph went from arrogance to humble leadership. He's done a lot of scriptures, and the Tao Te Ching is a really difficult book to approach. I had a friend this year who was a Christian dude. He went to ministry school. Now he's in counseling school. And he asked me, hey, since I'm going into counseling and like not just from a Christian perspective, I want to expand my horizons. I want to read something like Eastern. What do you think would be a good, do you have any recommendations? And I recommended the Tao Te Ching. And he came back a few weeks later. We met and talked about it. And he was just like, I'm so open to learning. I want to expand my horizons. I pick up this book, I read it, and it does not mean anything. Like, I read the words on the page, I get to the end of the page, I did not learn anything. Like, it's saying nothing. I don't even understand where I'm supposed to, I don't even know how to engage with this text. It's like, it's not saying anything. And that's frustrating because good descriptions of ultimate reality are saying nothing, because they're trying to point you towards the dimension of reality that's underneath everything. And so it's not, you can't read the Tao Te Ching with the goal of seeing through another paradigm. Like, oh, I can see through a Christian paradigm. Let me try seeing through a Taoist paradigm. It doesn't work like that. The Taoist approach is to drop all paradigms. So it's not going to say, think about it like this instead of like that. It's going to say, don't think about it like this or that. And if you're there to learn a new way of seeing reality, assuming that yours is valid and this other one is valid, you're going to be frustrated and you're not going to get much out of it. Mm-hmm. And the Tao Te Ching doesn't have it's just not, it's like written about ultimate reality from the perspective of someone who knows ultimate reality. It's not written in a way that's designed to hand down to someone who's not familiar with what it's describing, what it's saying. So it's kind of lofty. And then add to that the fact that it's a legendary scripture. It's the second most translated book next to the Bible. And it puts it at this status where it's like, you read it and you're automatically intimidated because you assume that you're not supposed to understand it because then you'd be enlightened. Especially in Christian and post-Christian culture where we're taught Jesus was enlightened and nobody else. That's it. Everybody else just bow to that dude. He gets to understand reality. He gets union with God. Everybody else feed off the crumbs and be grateful. And that's not the Eastern approach. Like the Eastern approach is there's something beneath your body, beneath your thoughts, beneath your feelings, beneath all subjects and objects that's eternal. And that's always what you are. And you only don't notice that because you're confused and distracted. And reading the right philosophies and then obeying them by surrendering out of all the somethingness into the nothingness of silence can show you ultimate reality, and you can live that. So the Tao Te Ching means roughly the virtue or the way of life that naturally blossoms from ultimate reality. Or it's like the book of the virtue of ultimate reality. So it's the book that describes the way of life that just naturally happens when you wake up. Mm-hmm. But what's great about the second book of the Tao is you have somebody, Stephen Mitchell, who is really about his training, not just as a linguist, but as a meditator, and is taking that knowledge and handing it down to a Western audience. So it's an additional rung on a ladder, so to speak, between being confused and having that clear mind that the Zen masters and the Taoists talk about. And Stephen does it with an enormous amount of humor. It's an extremely informal book. It's a really striking dichotomy between what it's saying, like the depth of what it's saying, and then how playfully it's saying it. Mm-hmm. So like one example is, one more thing about the content of the book. So what it is Stephen's translation of and commentary on the scriptures passed down by the next two leading Taoists after Lao Tzu. So Lao Tzu writes the Tao Te Ching. And then, I should probably know the names. It was Hui Su and Huan Su. They were the two next top leaders of Taoism.
Okay.
But their dialogues are, I can't remember which one right now, but one of them more understanding and one of them more still trying to figure it out. Mm-hmm. So you're reading the dialogue as they wrestle with what Lao Tzu left behind.
Okay.
And try to explain it in more clear human terms.
So it's a translation of them attempting to explain and understand the Tao Te Ching better and Stephen Mitchell's commentary about what he thinks about their conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Okay.
And then I think I think I'm being a little more true to the spirit of Taoism by saying they were trying to figure out the Tao, not the Tao Te Ching, but it's just,
okay.
But it was just like the next iteration of Taoism after the Tao Te Ching. Mm-hmm. So they're taking what Lao Tzu left behind in the Tao Te Ching and their own personal realization, and they're making it a little more accessible because sometimes as a white belt, it's better to learn from a yellow belt than a black belt because they're better at showing you, here's just the next step.
Right.
And then Stephen Mitchell is taking that and handing it down further. And that's what scripture is like people who have woken up from suffering and confusion, yet have enough grace and generosity to enter back into it, to hand it down to those who don't have it. Mm-hmm. Just like a sane clinician, not that there are many, counseling somebody who is on the outskirts of consensus reality and being willing to sound crazy in that conversation to try to help ground them. Like, I'm gonna meet you in your delusions so that through our dialogue, I can walk you back towards something that's more sane.
Yeah.
That's what these sages are doing when they're willing to sit down and write these scriptures and write these translations. Is like, I don't need to worry about this shit anymore. I'm not confused anymore. I don't have doubtful, anxious, hateful, vengeful, crazy thoughts anymore. But how can I explain this in terms that the average person can get? So to get into an example in the book, see which one I feel like doing first.
I love that ladder analogy. I think that's such a good way to picture it, like another rung on a rope ladder being flipped down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would always, if in the future, if somebody said, I'm curious about Chinese mysticism, be like, don't start with the Tao Te Ching because that's not really designed for you to be understood. Start with the second book of the Tao and then read the Tao Te Ching. I wrote down 58. Let's go to 58. Okay, this one is cool because it's a good example of how informal this text is as it makes the depictions that it's making. If you center yourself in non-being, and this is translation of one of the original dudes. What was it? Juan. It's so funny that I don't know their names because I mostly read it. I listened to the audiobook once too, and then I was like, oh, that's how you say it, and then I forgot. Hui Su and Wan Su. Hui Su, Wan Su. Hui Su, Wan Su. So this is one of them. If you center yourself in non-being, your mind becomes one. If your mind has become one, there is no opening in you through which harm can enter. When a drunk falls from a wagon, he won't be killed, no matter how fast the wagon is moving. His body is like other men's, but the way he falls is different. Life and death mean nothing to him, thus fear can't enter his heart. He meets all circumstances like an infant without a thought. Unconscious that he is falling, he falls softly, and his bones bend like the branches of a tree. If there is such safety in wine, how much more in wisdom? And then Stephen does some commentary on how drunks can teach us a lot. And you've heard stories of people who fell from airplanes but were unconscious when they hit the ground, so there was no tension in their body, so they bend and flex all crazy and they don't die. Versus, have you ever heard something like that?
I haven't heard that. No, I know there are a few people that have fallen out of an airplane and survived, but I didn't know that there was a connection to being unconscious. But that makes some sense. Yeah.
So I love that scripture can give an example like that because it just helps ground it in the everyday normalness of human reality, you know?
Yeah. I've never given that any thought. The idea that because I have heard that people that are drunk are more likely to not get hurt when they fall because they're looser and they don't try and stop themselves. But I never thought about the idea that it's maybe they're just not even thinking about the possibility of getting hurt, and there could be some sort of, I don't know, spiritual or some sort of belief thing happening there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool.
We kind of live in a way that anticipates suffering, tense up at the possibility of it occurring in a manner that probably just causes it sometimes, if not worsens it.
Yeah, I'm very convinced that there is at least some reality to that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I wrote this. I marked this one down to share because it's a great example of a dialogue that demonstrates an everyman as an enlightened person. And those are so useful because that's something that you don't get from Scripture. It's a lot of the time, Scripture implies that since you're reading the Scripture and that person wrote the Scripture, that person who wrote the Scripture has something that you, the reader, don't have. So the more you formalize Scripture and put it up on a pedestal, and the more, that person's the sage, the less likely you are to be willing to actually hear and implement what it's saying because you think it's not for you.
Right. Yeah.
So this book has so many examples of a woodworker, a fisherman, etc., who have extremely enlightened quips. And then Stephen Mitchell's humorous commentary on top of it. And it just grounds it in you never know. The guy working at the gas station could be enlightened and so uninterested in matrix-based hierarchies that he's perfectly happy just being amongst the people. So he feels a sense of oneness with them anyway. And this quip was cool anyway. As Wang Su was fishing in the river Pu, Pu'u, I don't know. Two high officials arrived from the king of Chu and said, "Sir, the king requests that you come to the capital and serve as his prime minister." Without turning his head, Wang Su answered, "I have heard that in Chu there is a sacred tortoise that died 3,000 years ago. The king keeps its shell in the temple, wrapped in silk and encased in a golden box. Now, if you were this tortoise, would you prefer to be venerated in such a way, or would you rather be alive again, crawling around in the mud?" "The latter, certainly," said the officials. Huang Su said, "Give my compliments to His Majesty and tell him that I am happy right here crawling around in the mud."
That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah. And there's a similar story in here where there's a royal dude of some sort reading scripture, and a blue collar worker who's nearby walks in and says, "Why are you reading those texts?" The guy says, "Well, I'm trying to attain the wisdom of the sages." And the guy, janitor or whatever he was, says, "That's not the wisdom of the sages. That's just the dredge that they left behind." Oh, he was like a wheel maker or something like that. Because then the fancy guy says, like, "How dare you explain yourself, or I'm going to have you beheaded," blah, blah, blah. And the guy is like, "Well, yeah, I can explain. As a wheel maker, I know when I'm applying too much pressure or too little pressure because I can feel it in the way that the wheel's turning as I'm crafting it. When I'm on the sweet spot, I know the feeling of the sweet spot, but I can't train the next person to know that because it's something intuitive. I know when I've struck that balance, and that's my skill as a craftsman. I can't teach someone else how to do that, and nobody else could teach me how to do that. So that's why I'm saying the scripture is just the dredges that the sages left behind." And so that story and this tortoise story are both examples of how we can idolize scripture so much that it seems like the past was more enlightened than the present, or that, certain people have something that other people don't have. And we're better off really taking seriously the task of like inquiring into ourselves and remembering what we are. We're better off doing that than reading scripture, using scripture to inspire ourselves to look within in a different way, or, get an idea of the goal that we're going for, and then taking on the practice of our own might be helpful. But I love it so much when scriptures are suicidal. They're just like, "Hey, we're telling you this, but like throw this in the garbage.
Get rid of this book." Yeah.
Yeah. Get rid of this book. Like as soon as you can. And, this book does it all over it.
That's awesome. Like the book is training wheels and it wants you to be done with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, I could have just gone down a rabbit hole, but I'm getting better at not doing it.
Proud of you.
Like we were having a conversation about Gnosticism, like right before we got on the podcast. And it's like, I almost just went down a 15-minute Gnostic rabbit hole. I would not need to go down. This was one of my favorite, definitely my favorite moment in this book is there is a conversation described between Huang Tzu and Hui Tzu. And when Stephen Mitchell does his commentary on it, he explains that Huang Tzu, as he was teaching Hui Tzu, so I glance down every time I say the name, as he's teaching him, he lies to him. He just blatantly lies. He doesn't represent the way that he feels accurately because it wouldn't be the best way to teach him in the moment. And that's so useful because something like the Tao Te Ching can give you words that a sage wrote. But when you've got something like this where a sage can explain what was going through the mind of a different sage when he said something to someone who wasn't enlightened, it's really giving you a glimpse of how it works. It's like such an under the hood, behind the scenes moment.
Interesting.
So Huang Tzu's wife had passed away and he was celebrating, and Hui Tzu wanted to understand how he was celebrating that his wife had died. He's like, "I loved my wife. I was present for the entire time that I loved my wife, and my wife doesn't not exist. Like what was essential about my wife didn't cease to exist. Her body's not here anymore. We had a lovely life together. I'm still happy." But he made it sound to Hui Tzu like at first he mourned, and then he realized, oh, she's not gone in any real eternal sense. And we had a happy life together, and it's all one moment anyway, and it doesn't matter. These are just fleeting forms. He made it sound like that, like he at first mourned, but then he realized. And so Stephen Mitchell says, in his reply, Huang Tzu is the soul of patience. It's amazing what lies come out of his mouth. He speaks as though he had waited for his wife to die in order to understand about death. That would have been to close the barn door after the horse was stolen. Actually, his whole account of gradual discernment is a fairy tale to cushion the shock to his friend's sensibilities. This is called skillful means. If he bent over backward any further, his ears would be touching his ankles. In reality, there was no mourning, no looking back, no realization, no stopping. Huang Tzu's wife died. He loved her. He was a happy man.
That's cool. Yeah. And I suppose in a sense, it's like he's rearranging the timeline, but there was a time in his life where he would have mourned and would have been worried about the idea of death.
Right.
So in a way, it's kind of true.
Right.
From a certain point of view.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was one of two examples I can remember from the book where something technically immoral was described, but attributed to an enlightened person. The other one, and I think that rule breaking is really cool, because if what's essential and eternal is what is truly real, then any actions or thoughts that we engage in that serve wholeness are good, and the things we do that disintegrate and confuse are not good. But then there's no technical points where you can say this exact action is always bad. Like in Buddhist morality, for example, not eating meat is strongly encouraged. Not killing animals is encouraged. But there's a story in here of an enlightened butcher who never has to sharpen his knife, and every time he cuts the ox, he just perfectly weaves through the bones, doesn't touch the bone, perfectly cuts the meat, is completely in a flow state the whole time. And a prince stops by and talks to the butcher, and the butcher explains to the prince how the perfectness with which he carves an ox is a symbol for how to live life perfectly, and the prince loves his wisdom. They have this great conversation. And then Mitchell comes in and says, this violates Buddhist morality in a way that promotes Buddhahood, because if it's really eternal reality that's true, and all the subjects and objects of the universe that are fleeting and temporary and not really consequential on the grand scale, then whether you're an expert at calligraphy or carving an ox is irrelevant. It's the expertness, it's the flow state, it's the emptiness of the mind of the craftsman that defines him as enlightened, defines him as realized.
Yeah.
And the rules get thrown out in that case. It's like, yeah, they're relative rules, but no, it doesn't matter. So the fact that Huang Tzu lied. It's like lying generally causes more disintegration than integration.
Sure.
Generally serves separation more than wholeness. But in that case, he was lying because it wouldn't have benefited his friend to explain, like, no, I never even blinked when she died. Like, it never even crossed my mind to mourn my wife. That doesn't make any sense. That wouldn't have been helpful. He would have just gone, that guy's mean. Maybe I shouldn't listen to him. So I think those are really cool examples.
They are, yeah. I like that.
Okay, the weirdest one here, like the boldest thing that this book does is explicitly states that nothing in the universe is real, and that the only thing that is real is the Tao. And I read the Tao Te Ching at least 5 or 6 times before I picked up this book, and I never got that from it. I've always really liked the Tao Te Ching, and I got into A Course in Miracles, and A Course in Miracles is based on the premise that God or ultimate reality is real, and everything else is not just temporary but illusory. Like, something is only real if it's eternally real.
And so the Tao is God. The Tao is God, and it also means like way, right? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, they're both like two different cultures from two different perspectives came up with symbols for ultimate reality, and so the base, like the relative philosophical orientations of the culture determine the kinds of symbols that we want to use for what is really beyond symbols. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, in Eastern philosophy, it's more of a way. And in Western philosophy, it's more of the peak of a hierarchy. Technically speaking, it's not the peak of a hierarchy, but it's beyond the hierarchy. So it's like further than the top, or the Jews thought of God as before the beginning, you know? So whether you think of it before the beginning or higher than the top, or such a perfect way that it isn't a way at all, is just saying, hey, you know, one of those hierarchies, and the concepts get truer and truer as you go all the way to the top of one of those, and then just abandon it or go beyond it. There's a lot of ways to do life, but there's a way that isn't a way because it's in the present eternal moment. So it's not a way.
Yeah.
There's a hierarchy of values, and things like goodness and love and truth and beauty are near the top. But what's really at the top isn't hierarchy at all, because it's such a state of oneness, it can't be compared to another value. So they're different symbols. So I would say, yes, God and the Tao are both symbols that two different cultures have come up with for ultimate reality.
Yeah.
I think they're the same thing. And so A Course in Miracles, which is a spiritual workbook that purports to be the channeling of Jesus, something that I got into a few months ago. It gives you like thought exercises for dropping lies and illusions in your mind that keep you in things like resentment and confusion and anxiety and whatnot.
Yeah.
And it starts with that premise that God is what's real. Like in our daily life, if something is only real for a second and then we realize it's not there, we say, oh, it wasn't real. But when it comes to things like your body and my body, even though we know they're going to vanish and they're not real forever, we say, well, they're real, just relatively real. Like infinity is permanently real and these forms are temporarily real. Well, in where mysticism peaks, it says, no, it's not that the eternal is eternally real and the temporary is temporarily real. It's that the eternal is real and the temporary isn't. But I never got that out of the Tao Te Ching reading it repeatedly. I never got that. But then I read Disappearance of the Universe, which is an introduction to the Course in Miracles, started working the course, realized, the holographic theories of reality are pointing to this same realization in neuroscience and in physics. And then realized, the Book of Thomas is also alluding to the same realization. And I kept feeling drawn to the Tao Te Ching, and I read it again, and I realized that idea that only the eternal is real and everything else is a temporary illusion that's really just preventing us from experiencing love and joy. I realized that's totally compatible with the Tao Te Ching. Then I stumbled into this book at Adventures Underground and realized, this is about the Tao, and it's written by my favorite translator of the Tao Te Ching, so this got to be good.
Yeah.
And he's stating it so explicitly in this book, maybe more explicitly than I've read it stated anywhere. And so this book has my single favorite scripture I've ever read. I hope I can find the page because I don't know if I wrote it down. Yeah, right here. This is my favorite page of scripture in the world.
Cool.
The ancient masters saw deeply. How deep was their insight? They realized that nothing exists. This is perfect understanding. Those at the next stage thought that things existed, but saw no boundaries between them. Next came those who saw boundaries, but didn't judge things as good or bad. When judgments arose, understanding was damaged. When understanding was damaged, preferences became ingrained. But is there really such a thing as damage or wholeness? The master understands that there is nothing to understand. So it's breaking down the ladder as we talked about the ladder at the beginning.
Yeah.
The top of the ladder is the realization that only God is real. That's the only eternal identity. That's all that there can possibly be. The next one is, things exist, but there's a oneness behind them. And then the next one is there's not necessarily a oneness behind them. Things exist, but they're not good or bad. It's all just stuff. So there's nothing at all. There's only one thing. There's multiple things, but the multiplicity is arbitrary. And then beneath that, the fourth rung and down is confusion, is insanity. It's like there's different things, and some things should be preferenced. That's the beginning of what Easterners would call ego. Like the belief, I want to be the very best at what I do. It's like all of those things we say that are just everyday language. I want to be the best at this. So you want to separate yourself from others by being better than them at something.
Sure.
Rather than being sanely at one with everyone. All of our basic assumptions arise from the idea that things are not only separate, but distinct and different and significantly so. But as soon as you notice... first you can notice that it's all just stuff. So you still see multiplicity, but it's all stuff, like static. But then you notice that beneath the static, there's only one thing. It's all oneness. But then you realize that oneness can't really be something, because something is the opposite of nothing. So there's really nothing at all. God isn't really something or nothing. And there's some really, really absurd scriptures in this anthology, in the second book of the Tao, that say before time, there was something. Before there was something before time, there was something. For there to be something, there was nothing. For there to be nothing, there had to be something before nothing. And it's not designed to it's not really a logic equation, like if A, then B, if B, then C. It's not really leading you somewhere concrete. It's just taking you in an absurd circle. Because we can't exactly use finite tools like words to describe the infinite, but the finite can realize its own futility. So like finite beings can use finite concepts like words to notice that finitude is futile. It's like if we take this whole thing in a logical stream, it goes nowhere. So using finite concepts, you can arrive at the realization that all you can do is drop the conversation, and that might actually lead to the realization, but you can't directly describe it. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think it does. I think I get it. Yeah.
So I think one thing that would be cool to bring up right now is 2 examples of Well, I'll just use one, actually. So Stephen Mitchell, in his interview with Tony Robbins, he was asked about enlightened people in the 20th century, and he was only willing to name one. He was only willing to say there's at least one person in the 20th century that was a genuine, completely enlightened person, and the person he named was Ramana Maharshi. Ramana Maharshi is also Eckhart Tolle's favorite yogi. So, and I respect.
I think you told me about him recently. Yeah, it does feel familiar. Yeah,
yeah, and Ram Dass also was a huge admirer of Ramana Maharshi. In the interview that Ram Dass and Eckhart Tolle did together, they talked about Ramana Maharshi,
right,
and how the picture of him is their favorite picture of an enlightened human being.
Yeah.
So we respect all of those guys' opinions, obviously, and they all point to Maharshi as like, yeah, that was definitely one. So he didn't describe. The method that he described for awakening was self-inquiry. So it was just basically, if you wanted to know something about a car, you'd ask for an expert on cars, right? Hey, can you tell me something about cars? Well, if you want to understand existence, you have to ask somebody that exists. That would be like an expert, right? But you can't ask another person about existence because they're existing in a different way than you are. So and you can't really give the question to something external, because if you're not asking somebody around you, you're asking the question within. So, well, then we try to ask the question to something external that we access within. But the most basic thing about us, this is just one other way of explaining this, you wouldn't trade your awareness for anything, right? Like if I said, I'll give you $1 million, but you can't be aware of it. You're like, well, that's not a very good deal.
Right.
I need the awareness.
Yes.
And you can plug any object or subject or reward or quality or anything into that and say, well, awareness is what's fundamental. We're aware.
Yeah.
Hence, like the phrase, I am that I am as a description of God. So basically where Ramana Maharshi guides people is your awareness is the most fundamental thing you have. You want to know about the nature of reality. Ask what is asking the question. So that in you which asks the question, what is existence? What is the meaning of life? What is reality? That in you asks itself. So that's the practice of self-inquiry.
Okay, yeah.
So you just repeatedly ask yourself your question. And the most fundamental question is, who am I? Because if you exist and what you're looking for is the ground of existence, then all you can do is turn in on yourself. And your awareness asking the question, asks itself, who am I? So that was the method that he described. Repeatedly, as a daily practice, ask yourself who you are until you answer the question for yourself. And in the Ramana Maharshi dialogues, there's a book published called Talks. It's like he didn't write any books or anything. He just sat around and people went and asked him shit and wrote down what he said.
Right.
And then he approved a brief anthology of these dialogues. And in them, he was asked, what would happen with the universe around us if we woke up completely? And he said it would vanish. There would be nothing. Everything around us would completely vanish if we woke up. And so Ramana Maharshi is describing the same thing that Stephen Mitchell is as he translates these Taoist scriptures, which is that that in you, which is wondering about reality, is the only thing that can answer the question, what is reality? And so now to go back 3 minutes ago where we talked about that ridiculous loop, that Ouroboros of questioning of something before time, something before that. So that would be something, but before something, there'd have to be nothing. But then nothingness would need to be invented. That's what that question is designed to do, is turn you in on yourself. So that's why those Taoist scriptures are written that way, in the same spirit in which Ramana Maharshi says, if you want to know existence, you exist. Ask yourself what existence is.
Right.
And that's where you're going to find the answer.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I'm enlightened now.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm good.
You asked yourself?
Yeah, I'm all good now. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. And then the Stephen Mitchell's wife is a Course in Miracles lady. Her name is Byron Katie, and she does
When you say she's a Course in Miracles lady, like she's just really into it, or
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so she created kind of a self-therapeutic modality called the work, and it's about detecting lies in yourself and correcting them with antidotal truths. And basically, this whole stream of thought that I feel is emerging into the mainstream right now, and I think it's a great thing, between holographic theories, the Gnostic scriptures, A Course in Miracles, these fresh new translations of Taoism, the work that Ramana Maharshi did, it's all united by this idea that we can't ask ourselves that question and recognize what is true on an absolutely basic level Oh, and Eckhart Tolle I would throw in there as well. The only scripture that Eckhart Tolle references by name is A Course in Miracles and The Power of Now. So he makes references to biblical verses and I think Bhagavad Gita verses. But in the beginning, he'll say, if I make reference to an enlightened person like Buddha or Jesus, or if I make reference to a scripture like A Course in Miracles, or some text like A Course in Miracles. So
I forgot that was mentioned in there. Huh.
yeah, and on his YouTube, he reads it a lot. So this is a very abstract but very coherent new stream of thought. Not new, technically speaking, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And that's what its premise is that there are so many lies, distractions, and noises in the way that we're experiencing reality, the way that we're projecting reality, that we fail to ask ourselves the basic question, the most obvious question in the world, that would do away with all of the other problems. And this book is so incredible because when someone who's realized that tries to communicate it, well, they're trying to communicate it from the perspective of somebody who doesn't give a shit about the fact that, like, it's like, oh, you're stuck in the muck of concepts and objects and subjects. No, you're not. That's not even real. Why would I give a shit? So it's like they've completely woken up out of problems. They're free of them.
Yeah.
But they're going to enter into the problematic in order to try to free subjects and objects from the realm of problems that doesn't exist.
Right.
That's a tricky thing to happen.
Yeah.
And so the best that we can do is read a translator's summary of an anthology of guys trying to figure out what a sage said, you know,
Yeah.
and just try to let that trickle down
Right.
until it convinces us.
Try to let more rungs down even lower.
Right.
Yeah.
Until we allow ourselves to be convinced to just ask ourselves the question. And that's where the journey ends.
Yeah.
So it's an incredible book. I'm going to recommend this book so much. It's going to be one of those books that I give away and then have to rebuy. His humor, his clarity, the informality of it. It's repeated reminders not to take it as a form, as a book too seriously. Stephen Mitchell's accomplishments as a scholar and as a meditator. This is just an unbelievable book.
That's awesome. It sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's all I got.
All right.
I did a short one on, like, I actually did it.
You did it 2 hours.
No,
yeah.
it's 40 minutes. Like 35 minutes long.
Yeah.
Whatever.
All right. Well,
Night
night school.